We're going to talk about this paper, this incredibly long paper that I did, and I thought the easiest way into it would be to explain how I came to write this paper and what I was trying to wrestle with in writing this paper. So this paper has its origin in something that Mike Rappaport wrote, in which he pointed out that if you're a new originalist and you think that original meaning runs out at a certain point, and then the rest is construction, well then what is the relationship of construction to the Constitution itself? In other words, how are they connected at all? Doesn't that mean that you're in sort of a free-floating decider in the world of construction? So that was an important criticism, and so I began to think about the problem. I already thought I had the beginnings of an answer, but in the meantime, Randy and Evan wrote a very fine piece in which they began to answer that question. And in their article, The Letter and the Spirit, they approached the question in terms of fiduciary duty and good faith, arguing that legal officials have a duty when they construe the Constitution, when they engage in construction, to try to further the Constitution's purposes and point with a good faith approach. And that was extremely helpful to me in thinking about it. The next thing I need to tell you in thinking about the problem was that I had already begun the beginnings of an answer in 2013 when I wrote a piece on how lawyers use history in constitutional construction. In Living Originalism, which comes out in 2011, I had just sort of randomly said, well, of course, in construction, we'll just use the familiar categories that Philip Bobbitt tells us are the ones that people use when they make arguments. And I gave examples of it in several of the chapters in Living Originalism, but I didn't really theorize the question very much. I didn't really strongly work on the question. And so I just assumed that that would be a good enough answer. And over the years, it became clear to me that wasn't a good enough answer. And I first started to attack the question by thinking about how people use history. And it became clear to me that the way that people use history was they never directly used history. Rather, they channeled history through some theory of justification or some theory of argument, which explained why history was relevant. And that particular channeling, that particular mode of justification, explained what history you would look for and why that history would be relevant and what it would demonstrate. And so that article, that 2013 article, is a way station toward trying to figure out this problem. About 20 years ago, Sandy Levinson and I had organized a symposium for Philip Bobbitt on publication of his book, Constitutional Interpretation, and that began an argument that I've had with Philip over the course of 20 years, in which I, although I'm very fond of him and I think very highly of his work, I still found that his particular approach to the problem of how you make constitutional arguments was wanting in certain respects. One of those respects was how he thought about history. But another was that as I became an originalist right around 2006, 2007, there was a problem for me. It wasn't one I hadn't really solved, which is that Philip's theory is anti-originalist. That is to say, if you are an originalist, as I am, and you are saying in your book, right, oh, the way that we handle construction is by simply using Bobbitt's theory, you've got a real problem. You've got to fit these things together because his theory says that originalism is not legitimate, right? And he says this in several places in his work. So I had a puzzle I had to figure out. The way I solved the puzzle, and here I'll make reference to my friend Stanley Fish, has to do with the history of rhetoric. When I was working on rhetorical tropes in tort law and criminal law in the 80s, I think I met Stanley later in the 90s. He, at one point, sidled up to me and said, you know, Jack, you really should read Quintilian and Cicero. These guys basically did it all long ago, and you're reinventing the wheel. And so after that, I started to delve into the history of ancient rhetoric, and sure enough, I was inventing the wheel. And that then brought me to the work of Chaim Perelman and Theodor Vivig, and all these people who had basically tried to take the classical tradition in rhetoric and try to explain its connection to legal reasoning. And that was the thing that helped me solve the problem. That Bobbitt is just a version of the classical rhetorician's tradition. That is, he's offering a topic catalog, a particular topic catalog, a contingent topic catalog, not the only one that you could offer, and that it was through the idea of topics that we could finally solve the problem of how constitutional argument connects up to the Constitution. So in the piece, I make 2 points, one based on Evan and Randy's point, and another one based on topics. The point from Evan and Randy is that you first have a particular attitude toward the act of construction, which is one of good faith. They focus on government officials. I say it applies to everyone, citizens as well as officials. But it requires that you think of yourself as attempting to further and promote the Constitution as opposed to just whatever you want to do. And that attitude is central to the idea of interpreting a Constitution rather than doing something else. That interpretation fidelity is the name of the game. If you're not after fidelity, you're not after interpretation. So that's one part of the piece. The other part of the piece, though, is, well, what techniques would you use in order to ensure that what you're doing is actually furthering the Constitution? That is, promoting the Constitution and not just simply whatever it is you want to do. And here, the classical conception of topics really helps us. Topics in this particular setting, I mean, is a much larger thing to talk about, but in this particular setting, a topic is premised on a commonplace view about what is a valid or appropriate way to argue in a particular subject. That is, and by commonplace, I don't mean that it's fully theorized. Often it's not completely theorized. There's plenty of room for disagreement. But the idea is people, if you say, well, how would we go about solving a problem? You say, well, you might want to look at the text, or you might want to look at purpose, or you might want to look at structure, or you might want to look at, go through the whole list. And what these commonplaces do is they give you something to latch on to. They give you something to build with. They give you a way of solving a problem. And in the classical tradition, all three of these ideas, that is, giving you something to talk about, giving you a place in which to look for an answer, giving you a way to articulate and diagnose a problem and solve the problem, and giving you a way to persuade someone else that your solution to the problem is a good one or a reasonable one. All of these ideas are captured in the single idea of the topic, the topos, the place. And so this conception of rhetoric is one in which the point of rhetoric is simultaneously the understanding, diagnosis, and solving of problems and the persuasion of an audience with whom you already share something in common. That is the realm or the location in which rhetorical argument occurs. This is what helps us solve the problem of construction. This helps us to answer the question that Mike Rappaport posed, which is how can we say that there is a latch onto or connection to or the furtherance of the Constitution? The answer is if our arguments are based in commonplaces, rhetorical commonplaces about what is a valid way of solving a constitutional problem, analyzing a constitutional problem, persuading other people about what the Constitution means, then we should build our arguments based upon the topics. These topics. These topics, in turn, help assure our audience that even if they don't agree with us in all respects, at least we're talking about something we have in common. At least we believe that both of us think that this is an appropriate or valid way to solve or analyze a constitutional problem and to argue about it. Construction, therefore, the construction zone, to use Larry Solem's phrase, is the zone of topical argument. Now, topics themselves, and this is another place in which I disagree with Philip, topics themselves don't commit us to any particular constitutional theory. You can be an originalist. You can be a pluralist. You can be a John Hart Ely representation reinforcement person. Any version, in fact, of modern constitutional theory can be cashed out in terms of how it uses the commonplaces of constitutional argument and how it rearranges them into different structures. So, for example, originalists all take the following view, that the task of interpretation involves discovering that which is fixed and then applying that which is fixed to the problem at hand. New originalists are dualists in the sense that they believe that you discover what is fixed and apply it to the extent you can, and then you use other topics for that which cannot be fully determined by original meaning. But the connection is the connection offered by topics. the argument I make in the paper is that even non-new originalists, that is, old originalists or other kinds of originalists, have something like this, although they don't call it that, for reasons that are perfectly understandable given what they're trying to achieve. But they still have to make reference to the topics, and they still have to use the topics. In fact, they do use the topics, often in the feature of what they call interpretation, that is, constructing and making sense of original meaning. And that also helps us to understand why lawyers with very different political views and very different theoretical assumptions will end up talking to each other in ways that they are mutually comprehensible, because what they share in common is not a basic underlying theory of constitutionalism or a basic theory of constitutional interpretation. What they share are the topics.